As the leaves turn and shadows grow longer, the whispers of Halloween beckon us closer to the unknown. Join us on a chilling journey as we dive into 3 spine-tingling tales that blur the line between reality and the supernatural. From a haunted encounter on a quiet street to a nightmarish visit from a stranger and a haunting discovery in an abandoned house, these stories will keep you on the edge of your seat. But before we delve into tonight's terrifying tales, a huge shout out to all of you. Your support fuels this channel and keeps the nightmares coming. If our eerie stories captivate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a chilling episode. And if you want to help us grow and keep the fear alive, share our videos, drop a comment, or explore our support options on Patreon or Ko-fi. Every bit of support helps us bring you the best spine-tingling content. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey. Now let's embrace the shadows together. As we gradually welcome the fall season, I feel compelled to share an unsettling story from a few years back. I've recounted this experience to friends and family, but many of them have laughed it off, thinking I'm either joking or trying to frighten them. Yet deep down, I know what I saw that night was real, and I wish I could offer a clearer explanation. At the time, I lived on a quiet street just outside the city, not quite nestled in the suburbs. At the end of my block stood an old, run-down house, its paint peeling and windows boarded up, directly across from an empty parking lot that once served a now-defunct bar. This house had been the home of Mrs. Morgan, a cantankerous old woman who seemed to take delight in shouting at my friends and me as we passed by. She would holler absurd accusations, claiming we were trampling her garden or rummaging through her trash to play hide and seek. Despite our occasional antics around the neighborhood, we never bothered her directly. Our parents had always encouraged us to be respectful, especially since she was a widow living alone. 3 years ago, Mrs. Morgan sadly passed away, and soon after, her house fell into a state of disrepair, ultimately becoming condemned. I never got close enough to read the signs plastered on the boarded windows and doors, but it quickly became an eyesore in our once peaceful neighborhood. My girlfriend lived just a few blocks away, and I often walked to her house, a mere 4-minute stroll that took me past Mrs. Morgan's abandoned property and the dilapidated bar. Fast forward to that fateful Halloween night, about 3 a.m. on November 1st. I was returning home from my girlfriend's house after an evening of scary movies and indulging in leftover candy that her parents hadn't given out. We had lost track of time, caught up in the thrill of the season. As I approached my street, I found myself walking past the dilapidated house. That's when I heard a noise that made me stop in my tracks. For some inexplicable reason, my first thought was that it might be a skunk. I slowed my pace and turned to look at the house, and that's when I noticed something unsettling. The front door, which had always been securely boarded up, was now wide open. I tried to convince myself that the wind was to blame, but the night was strangely calm, devoid of any gusts. My curiosity and unease compelled me to pause in front of the house, my gaze fixated on the door. That's when I saw her, Mrs. Morgan, standing there, staring right back at me. I was certain it was her, despite knowing she had died in that very house, which had become uninhabitable. Fear coursed through me, and I instinctively shouted something, though I can't recall whether it was a coherent word or just a terrified gasp. To my horror, Mrs. Morgan stepped onto the porch, her gaze unwavering. Panic took over, and I broke my stare, turning on my heel and sprinting back toward my house. I glanced back occasionally, half expecting to see her following me. In what felt like an eternity, I reached my home, bolting through the side door and racing down to my room. Sleep was a distant memory that night. Whether it was sheer exhaustion or the remnants of a spooky Halloween, I couldn't say. But one thing was certain. I had seen Mrs. Morgan standing just a few feet away from me. In the aftermath, I've pondered whether it was a true paranormal encounter or merely a figment of my overactive imagination. I've come to realize that many people believe the boundary between the living and the dead is particularly thin on Halloween night, and now I find myself among those who truly believe it. This incident took place last Halloween when my little brother and I found ourselves home alone. Our parents had gone out to a Halloween party and left us in charge of handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This really bummed us out, as we had planned to go trick-or-treating with some friends. Our parents insisted we were too old for that, suggesting instead that we invite our friends over. But when I reached out to them, they all declined, eager to keep up the Halloween tradition. So it ended up being just my brother and me, stuck at home with a bowl of candy. As the night went on, many people stopped by, and by 10 p.m., nearly all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided to indulge in what was left. We settled on the couch, watching a scary movie and stuffing our faces with candy. Just as we were getting comfortable, there was a sudden knock at the door. I jumped off the couch, perplexed about who could be knocking at such a late hour. I figured it might be some last-minute trick-or-treaters, even though I had turned off the porch light and Halloween decorations to signal that we were out of candy. Maybe it was just our parents returning home early, I thought. Peering through the peephole, however, I saw a man standing on our porch, and my stomach dropped. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled up, obscuring most of his face. The only features I could make out were a scraggly beard and dry, cracked lips. It was clear he wasn't dressed for Halloween and was far too old to be out trick-or-treating. His hands were stuffed deep into his hoodie pocket, and he looked uncomfortably thin. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away from this guy. There was no way I was going to open that door. Watching through the peephole, I noticed he knocked again, a look of desperation on his face. He seemed to be trembling, which struck me as odd since it wasn't cold outside at all. A bad vibe washed over me, and I wanted him gone. I shouted through the door that we were out of candy, hoping he would just leave. To my horror, a smile crept across his face. It wasn't friendly. "Are you alone in there?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. My little brother, gripping his cell phone tightly, whispered, "Should I call the police?" The man let out a low grumble and replied, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." My heart raced. I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be armed. Taking a deep breath, I tried to sound as tough as I could. "Get the hell away from our house or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded, replaced by a look of fury that made my skin crawl. His teeth were yellowed, and in that moment I realized he might be some kind of homeless drifter with a serious issue. Thankfully, he turned and left without attempting to break in. I didn't stop watching him until I saw him step off our property. My brother and I sighed in relief, opting not to call the police since he hadn't tried to hurt us. We spent the rest of the night watching TV, a lingering paranoia hanging over us. When our parents returned, we kept quiet about the incident. After all, the man hadn't actually done anything. The following day, however, brought devastating news. We learned that an elderly woman who lived just a few houses down had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor discovered her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I exchanged horrified glances, immediately suspecting the man from the night before. We relayed our experience to the police, but without any clear details of his face, they had little to go on. They launched a search for the man, but he was never caught. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. If I had just called the police that night, perhaps we could have prevented that poor woman's murder. What disturbs me the most is that nothing was taken from her house. Her belongings remained untouched. Her door had been wide open, yet he chose to kill her instead of robbing her. It made me realize that his only intention was murder. He didn't want money or jewelry. He was driven solely by an urge to kill, and that thought chills me to the bone. Halloween of 2019 is a night I'll never forget. It still haunts my memories. Living in Australia, where Halloween isn't celebrated with much enthusiasm, we usually got only a handful of trick-or-treaters each year, maybe 5 or 6 at most. Despite my parents' lack of interest, I loved the holiday. I took charge of decorating our home and handing out candy, eagerly anticipating the few kids who would knock on our door. That year, Halloween fell on a stormy school night. As the rain began to pour around 6 o'clock, my decorations felt pointless, but I stubbornly stayed in the living room, watching The Conjuring to pass the time. About an hour and a half later, my phone buzzed with a message from my friend M in our group chat. He suggested we go trick-or-treating. I was taken aback. After all, we hadn't done that in over 5 years. But with no one knocking at our door, the idea seemed to bring some excitement to an otherwise dreary evening. Soon enough, my other friends, S, C, and H, were on board with the plan. We asked M where to meet, but oddly, he quickly claimed he couldn't make it, despite being the one to suggest the outing. He did, however, recommend a nearby house rumored to have a stash of delicious candy. Within half an hour, the 4 of us arrived at the house. The front porch was adorned with a large table displaying a pumpkin-shaped bowl overflowing with lollipops. After scanning the area to ensure we weren't being watched, we quickly grabbed the sweets, making sure to leave a few behind to avoid suspicion. Just as we were about to leave, the atmosphere shifted. 2 men dressed as clowns emerged from the shadows, their painted smiles and tilted heads sending chills down our spines. One of my friends screamed as they lunged toward us, their rubber noses squeaking with each step. We took off running, adrenaline fueling our escape. It felt like we ran for an eternity before finally losing them. Seeking refuge and a chance to process what had just happened, we headed to M's house. When he opened the door and erupted into laughter, we were confused. I reminded him that he was the one who suggested trick-or-treating, urging him to let us in. Once we settled on M's couch, we discovered something unsettling. M had lost his phone earlier that day. The suggestion to visit that particular house hadn't come from him at all. It was likely a trap set by the clowns. After a while, I made my way home around 9:30 p.m. After finishing my movie, I went outside to collect the candy bowl I had set up earlier. To my shock, it was completely empty. But my stomach dropped when I noticed a clown nose resting in the bottom of the bowl. Panicked, I rushed inside to tell my parents, showing them the creepy trophy left at our doorstep. They shrugged it off as a Halloween prank, but as I tried to sleep that night, I was jolted awake around 1 a.m. by the sound of rocks hitting my bedroom window. My heart raced with fear, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled back the blinds, only to find my Halloween decorations strewn across the ground below. Just then, a lollipop came flying through the air, hitting my window with a loud thud. I looked up and froze. There they were, the 2 clowns perched on my neighbor's roof, watching me intently. I screamed and bolted to my parents' room. The details that followed are a blur, but we called the police. Unfortunately, they found no trace of the clowns. The officers assured us they would check out the house we had visited earlier, but they left empty-handed within half an hour. The next morning, we learned that the house was abandoned and M's phone had been found inside. At school the next day, I found out that M, S, C, and H all had their own eerie experiences that night. Whether the clowns had followed us home or tracked us through M's phone, I couldn't say. All I knew was that Halloween was just weeks away, and I was filled with dread, haunted by the fear of their return. If you've encountered a terrifying event or have a spine-chilling horror story to share, we at Eerie Shadows want to hear from you. Share your experiences with us and let's uncover the mysteries lurking in the eerie shadows together. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more eerie tales and spine-chilling stories like this one.